chair of the Homeless and Housing for the Midtown South Community Council. And Alex, won't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, John. I'm Alex from the West Side Neighborhood Alliance. You might have seen our initials floating around, WSNA. We're not a radio station, that's just our initials. We're the baby sibling of housing conservation coordinators who've been functional since the 1970s. But the West Side Neighborhood Alliance has only been around since about 2006. Thank you.
Thank you. Janice, you want to introduce yourself? Kevin, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Janice Oliver from the Living Well Community Metro Baptist Church.
Super. Kevin? Daniel?
Sorry. My name is Dan Pitchinson. I'm the Executive Director of Ryan Chelsea Clinton Community Health Center. We're located on 10th Avenue between 45th and 46th.
Rue?
Hi, everyone. Rue Parkin, Executive Director of Help NYC.
Great. Margaret?
Hello, I'm Margaret McEnroe. I'm a combined media artist. I'm volunteering for MSCC, and I got involved because I'm an alumni at Hunter College on West 41st Street, which is part of the Empire State Development, and it is going to be affordable housing. We're advocating for a cultural center and more arts, design, and advocacy for social equity in our Hell's Kitchen, Hudson Yards Hell's Kitchen. I'm also representing our co-op on West 34th Street, and we formed with John's inspiration, a West 34th Street Alliance. So we hope to be able to create positive things and help for these really urgent issues with housing, office space, and land use.
Great.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's everybody put our affiliation in with our name if we could, please. That might help when other people's join and also, yeah, just for reference. Okay. Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, y'all. Tom Kaler, West Side Neighborhood Alliance. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And Ramona's here. Ramona's going to be speaking today. She's one of our speakers today. You want to say hello, Ramona?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us. Looking forward to it.
Good. Good to have you. Tom, are you back with us? You want to introduce yourself? Kevin?
I'm here, Kevin, Amtrak PD.
Okay. All right. So we're still loading up with some people. It's still early. It's 9:29. I'm going to just pop up the agenda for everybody. Take a look. This is what we have in store today. We're going to be speaking about what we talked about in the policy meeting just prior to this meeting. We have some special introductions from a few people, and then we'll get to the NYCHA conversation with, what did I do here? It looks like I put NYCHA the heading, and it looks like I left some stuff from the old agenda. Anyway, that's what we have Ramona here for. And we have a community-led plan discussion going. And then we have some public concerns, and we'll wrap it up with requests and summaries. And that's pretty much the agenda. I'm going to stop this sharing. Hi, Marnie. We have a couple of minutes before we're starting. You want to just say
hi?
Yeah. How's everything going with the restaurant?
Oh, it's good. It's actually going really well.
Good.
Yeah. People, they like it. You know, it's going really well.
Good, good,
People
good.
like to drink wine. I don't drink, but you know what? A lot of people do.
Great. And Luana's here. Luana, you want to say hello to everybody? Luana? Maybe she's just still coming. Here she is. Hi. You want to say hello? Speakers out. There you go. Say hello. Well, Luana just joined the Midtown South Community Council's. Well, she hasn't quite joined. She's working with us a little more closely, I should say, right, Luana? And she's going to be working a little closely on the homeless and housing, and also she's stepping into some of our health issues as well. And thank you for doing that, Luana. Let's, yeah, you got some speaker issues? Yeah, sorry. All righty. Still not quite there with the head count. But Alex, you want to give a recap of our early morning meeting or our policy meeting?
Yeah, we talked about a law that was signed by Governor Hochul. It's called TDSHA, and that stands for Tenant Dignity and Safe Housing Act. And that is S4594 and A354, passed in both the Senate and the Assembly in the summer of last year and signed by Governor Hochul, thank God. It's pronounced TDSHA amongst housing activists, and it can be used as early as June 28th, 2023. And it focuses on habitability and like physical problems of your apartment. And as John was saying, it sort of circumvents the rigmarole of going through HPD and HCR, because it is a rigmarole if you do all that the way the status quo is. But this law, the Tenant Dignity and Safe Housing Act, makes it much easier because you can bring this directly to court, your grievances, and you don't even need a lawyer. And so that's what we talked about. I'll put the link into the chat for anybody who wants to learn more about it. And if you're having problems with your building or your apartment, if you can hang on to June 28th, this law might really be your best friend.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a little bit of time going, you know, if you go through DHCR, HPD, not that they're not doing their jobs, but they're sometimes we find them undermanned and it takes a little time. So this is some added benefit to pursue better conditions and to make sure the landlords are treating you better. And I think I've brought this up before, but I'm working to help a fellow resident here in my building, and his conditions are poor, and he's been in the hospital for past several months. He's went in for a heart, a heart operation. You know, supposedly it was supposed to be a little simple, but then he thought he was going to be in and out a week, but he ended up in a coma. And so while he's away, I'm trying to get his apartment and shaped up a little bit. It's pretty much of a disaster. The electrical wiring isn't taken care of. He can't use an air conditioning, and he's got to step into a tub. It's one of those old railroad type apartments. And so there's a lot of conditions that aren't really kept up within the building, and the fellow is being harassed too by other tenants that the landlord has put into the space, into one of the apartments here. And this is something that has taken time for me to do, putting the evidence together and so forth and pack it. And then I send it in, and of course it gets rejected, and then I have to send it back in. So there's a long process to protecting a tenant. I think we all know that. We see it all the time. I get calls from a lot of people. And so I think this would be a big help. I'm looking forward to implementing, using this tool.
I was telling John earlier that I was hoping somebody would jump in who knows more about the law than I do. I know precious little about it, but it sounds really powerful. And so if you know more about it, please jump in, take over. That'll be great.
Okay. All righty, back to our game plan today. We have some, let's go through some updates and introductions. Do we have any elected officials on today? I don't. Okay. Daniel, you want to give some updates and tell us what's going on?
So I'm the executive director of a federally qualified health center in Hell's Kitchen. We take everybody regardless of their ability to pay. Just in terms of the health world, is that it was in the papers today that New York State has settled with people who were on Medicaid and saying that there's restrictions on or unfair restrictions on access to some of the dental services. So we don't know the details yet, but there used to be like long delays to get or certain like root canals were not covered, implants and replacement dentures were not covered, but now New York State will start to cover them. So there'll be an expansion for dental services. So that's good news. And on the other side, there's not that many dentists that take Medicaid or Medicaid managed care plans. So that'll continue to be a struggle. Here at our health center, we have a 6-month waiting list just because we have 2 dentists and the demand is so high. That's all. That's
Okay.
the health.
Great, thanks, Dan.
Actually, I put a link to the article in the New York Times about the suit that was brought and the class action suit.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Rue, you want to any updates on your end?
Hey everyone, Rue, Executive Director at Help NYC. We don't have any informatic updates, with the exception that for the Midtown South area in Manhattan, we are prioritizing food pantries and soup kitchen listings. We're prioritizing that citywide. Any food assistance programs to get them on the website. In other areas of New York, we're prioritizing all services in tri-neighborhoods. So if you know of a neighborhood or if your zip code is a tri-neighborhood, please reach out to us. Also, as just fundraising and networking, our garden party is on the 23rd, and I will thank John for putting that in the last newsletter. The link in the newsletter is wrong. That's our sponsorship. Tickets are $50. I'm sorry, $75. But if you're part of MSCC, we can give you a discounted ticket. Or if your organization would like to sponsor, we have some packages. But let me know. It's going to be at St. John's in the Village on the 23rd at 6 o'clock. And we have a whole list of honorees, one of them actually being Maria Teresa, who's a housing advocate. She's our neighbor of the year, along with Link NYC, who is our partner of the year. So please join us if you can. Thank you.
Thanks, Rue. Hi, Miguel. We haven't had you here for a while. Miguel, any updates on your end?
No updates. Nice to see you, John.
Okay, nice to have you. I know there's a little conflict going over there.
Yeah, we're moving forward.
Yeah, Miguel's a tenant. You're the head of a tenant association over there, correct?
Correct. Both in houses.
Right. Okay. Carol, nice to have you here. Carol's an author.
I'm only here last briefly, but I wanted to tune in for a while. I thought maybe people should know about the I'm chairing the Two Bridges Neighborhood Council Board now, and they're having instead of a normal benefit with the big reception, they're having a concert, which includes at the Mariners Temple on 9 Oliver Street, and there'll be choirs from a Chinese Baptist Church, Mariners Temple, a synagogue, and other groups. And the theme is lift your voices against racism, anti-Semitism, and against Asian hate. And I thought it was sort of a neat idea. It's June 15th. It'll be on the Two Bridges Neighborhood Council website. So.
Cool. Yeah, send it.
That's
Send us
a
a
nice
link.
thing.
I'll make sure I post it in a newsletter. Carol, I'm looking on doing some forums, you know, in the latter part of the year, the latter half, I should say. And one's on affordable and housing and so forth. I'd love for you to participate, to be on the panel.
I'd be honored.
Right. No, we'd be honored.
Mhm.
Okay. Kevin, any updates on your end you want to speak about? I know this is your first time here in a while.
No, nothing to report.
Okay, great. All right. So if there is any new members here that will, okay. All right. So we're going to move on. We have Ramona here. Ramona, you want to introduce yourself, tell you about what you're doing and about what you're fighting for?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Guatuke Ini Inaru, and my colonial name is Ramona. I am a public housing tenant. My grandmother lived in public housing for about 33 years. And I moved into our unit about 4 years ago. I started Safe Section 9. I want to say now it's been almost 4 years. And Safe Section 9 focuses on educating and empowering tenants against the privatization of public housing, which is happening nationwide. So Marquise, who couldn't be here tonight, he is running the campaign for New York City and New York State. And I focus on congressional level, I would say, lobbying and outreach efforts. And I'm not sure how much time I have, John, but we do have a 3-minute video that gives folks a really good background on what the issue is, that does it way better than me before 11 o'clock in the morning.
Sure. You know what? I'm going to make you a co-host and you can run with it. And don't worry about the time.
Okay. So let me.
You should have co-host now.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and share that screen. Safe Section 9 is completely tenant and volunteer run. I always like to highlight that because folks see our content from our flyers to our video and are kind of impressed by it. The only funding, well, not kind of, they're super impressed by it. The only funding that we received over the last 3 years came from our state representative, Amanda Septimo, who opposes the privatization of public housing. We got $20,000 from her in discretionary spending. And we still have about half of that left. So we operate really slimly. So let me go ahead and share the video with you guys.
So you're asking for help, right?
Oh, yeah, I mean, always, but.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
A lot of people associate public housing with major cities like New York and Chicago, but the United States' 970,000 public housing units are spread out over all 50 states, with 20% located in rural areas. All public housing is paid for under Section 9 of the Housing Act of 1937, which allows the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to distribute taxpayer funds directly to each city's housing authority. The law's stated purpose was to address, quote, the acute shortage of decent, safe, and sanitary dwellings for families of low income, end quote. Section 9 caps rent at 30% of resident income, and gives residents the right to organize into resident councils to determine how many will be spent within their developments. Under Fiorello LaGuardia, NYCHA became the first agency in the US to provide publicly funded housing. Although welfare recipients and people of color were barred from these early developments, years of pressure by housing advocates eventually loosened these restrictions. And by the 1950s, working class Black and Puerto Rican residents had begun to move in. During the fiscal crises of the 1970s, these increasingly diverse developments became targets for budget cuts by politicians pandering to white anger toward the gains of the civil rights movement. Nixon halted all construction of new public housing in 1973. And in 1974, Congress created the Section 8 voucher program to push low-income tenants into the private market. Under the Reagan administration, HUD's budget was slashed even further, from $36 billion in 1980 to $15 billion in 1988. Reagan justified these cuts by stoking resentment towards public housing residents with the myth of the welfare queen, a person of color living lavishly off taxpayer assistance. As this stereotype took root, the combined effects of disinvestment and the crack epidemic devastated public housing and the lives of people who lived there. Instead of providing adequate funding, politicians used this crisis as evidence that public housing was an outdated model. With the Hope 6 program, President Clinton proved just as willing as Republican administrations before him to keep up the cruel cycle. Hope 6 provided grants for housing authorities to demolish existing developments, but they were not required to replace them with the same number of low-income units. Between 1993 and 2010, 98,592 units were demolished under Hope 6. Only 12% of those displaced actually moved back into their homes. When the Faircloth Amendment was passed in 1998, made the number of Section 9 units at that time the absolute limit to the national public housing stock. So today, HUD can't fund any construction of public housing above that 1998 level. Decades of austerity have left NYCHA with $40 billion in unmet capital needs. Residents experience the shortfall every day through shoddy repairs, chronic utility outages, and life-threatening mold and pest infestations. Following a familiar playbook, elected officials and NYCHA CEO Greg Russ now want to use their own neglect of public housing as an excuse to eliminate Section 9 through privatization schemes like RAD, the Blueprint for Change.
Okay. So I can go ahead and pause there to see if folks have any questions on the things that were mentioned in the video. I know a lot of folks here probably have experience with the voucher programs that end up applying to those folks that are eventually removed from public housing. If there are no questions, I'll kind of share with you the approach that we're taking. So instead of engaging Congress folks or people that are stakeholders at the federal level by asking what they're going to do for public housing, we have decided to start telling them exactly what we want. So my work history comes from before my disability, working for the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense on disaster risk reduction throughout Asia, which I like to think that makes me a perfect candidate to focus on public housing in America at this point. So we recognize that the conditions that tenants are living in are not desirable, but we also feel that what you lose with privatization just isn't a fair exchange. Go ahead, Carol.
Just very quickly, I admire your passion, and I agree with you to get funds for capital repairs, especially through Section 9, and to keep up the public housing we have. It's an important investment and we can really improve it. That doesn't mean I don't support RAD too, because I've seen some wonderful results. I'm thinking of Far Rockaway, I'm thinking of other places I've visited. And Citizens Housing and Planning has a very good program to enable the residents to be a partner and to be very involved in selection of developers, in the times when you do privatize it and to look at the financing. I'll keep quiet, but keep on support of Section 9. But I hope that doesn't mean that you're also standing in the way of some of the better RAD deals and some of the things that could really help the people who live in these buildings. And thanks for your good work.
So that's a really great point to make regarding the reasons why folks are turning towards RAD, right? So I would say that not only do I stand in the way of RAD, I am actively working to ensure that privatizations are stopped across the United States. And we can talk about the Rockaway specifically in a couple of reports, one which was done by the Human Rights Watch organization, and another one was done by Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which is actually a Queens-based tenant-led movement. In surveys, I'll go ahead and share the link for this. In surveys and research, Human Rights Watch was actually able to prove that RAD leads to higher eviction rates, about 25 to 50% higher than public housing. They also found that rents are increased, not because they're going above the 30% cap, which they usually promise to existing tenants, but because over time, developers in New York, Minneapolis, and we've seen this also in Oakland, will start adding what's called amenity charges, right? So a case that is really easy to pinpoint for this problem is one in Minneapolis. So Greg Russ came from Minneapolis and Cambridge, and he had a really long history of working on privatizing public housing. He had focused mostly on doing project-based Section 8, which is RAD or PAC. Now, RAD or PAC take the tenants and shift them out of public housing and put them into privatized housing through a special kind of Section 8 voucher. We always hear that, there's no will for public housing, that everyone should just accept the project-based Section 8. And our argument is that there is a lot of racism, which is affecting the lack of will, right? So in Minneapolis, for example, he started working with Section 18. So when we think about the different sections that apply to public housing, we have to remember Section 9 is straight public housing. Then we have Section 8, which is what I grew up under. So you have a voucher, you go around your neighborhood or your city, you look for a landlord, you hope that they're not racist, that they will allow you to rent from them, that it is in a slum-like condition, that your unit passes the inspection, and then you get to move in, right? So you're being subsidized with public monies because your family can't bear the cost of the rent by themselves. Then you have project-based Section 8. And this was created under the Obama administration because they couldn't get funding for housing while also fighting for the Affordable Care Act, right? So they chose one issue and had to leave the next. So under project-based Section 8, Section 8 money is created through public monies, right? This is money that should be getting used for all of the services that we need as folks that live in the United States. That voucher is no longer being issued to the individual household. So I live in Unit 17F. If my development here in the South Bronx were to privatize, the voucher would be sent to the housing authority or the housing management corporation. And that corporation would get monies being allocated to Unit 17F, not to the Ramona household. So what that means is that your family doesn't get any guarantee that they can remain in that unit, and that if they leave, as they had to do in Chicago, there's no right to return. So back to Minneapolis, right? So in Minneapolis, we found some tenants because they were going through this transition under Section 18, right? So Section 18, another number to remember, Section 18 is either demolition or dissolution. So I like to tell people demolition is think back to Chicago. We're actually in the 20th anniversary of the Cabrini Gardens being destroyed. That was Section 18. Dissolution is what's happening in New York and in Minneapolis. So through dissolution, you simply remove the actual unit out of the Section 9 database and it becomes privatized. When that happened in Minneapolis, they started introducing these amenity fees, but it wasn't amenities like, oh, we put in a pool or you now have access to a gym. it was things like if your kitchen sink had not been working properly and you had a chronic leak, you began to be charged monthly for the repairs that the new management company did to your unit. How's that legal? It's legal because once the lease gets changed from a lease that applies to public housing, which includes paragraphs that are directing you to the congressional statutes and the congressional pieces of legislation, the new development company can come in and say, well, we need to make sure that each tenant is responsible for wear and tear. And they felt that this woman's sink, which had been leaking for like 10 years and causing, extensive damage in her unit and other units, was not regular wear and tear. The housing authority for Minneapolis, they knew that that was a problem. They didn't do the repairs because of the lack of funding and because of the lack of accountability that the housing authorities are now operating under. So what ends up happening is that the tenant then starts facing rent burden, not because their rent has necessarily gone up above the 30%, but because they're introducing charges that a housing authority could never introduce, right? In New York, the plan that does this is called the trust. Sorry. About 2 years ago, it was being called the blueprint, and we ruined the advertising for that, and we just destroyed the term. So now it's called the trust. What the trust would do is that it would actually go into different spaces and it would privatize and it would turn us into project-based Section 8. It would be able to use our homes as collateral to take on debt in order to make the repairs that are necessary, but it keeps NYCHA as our housing management. Now, I love public housing and I'm trying to save it, but I don't give a damn about NYCHA. So I like to tell people I'm not in the business of saving a failing organization, which is why one of our congressional solutions for New York specifically is that we create a new housing authority. And the reason we're asking for that when it comes to New York, and I'll go through the solutions a little bit with you guys, is because as NYCHA was able to get this legislation adopted at the state level, NYCHA has started reorganizing itself since 2020 to focus on real estate and not focusing on the quality of life of tenants. So we don't feel that they can actually fulfill the mission, which is laid out by Section 9, and that would apply to a housing authority anymore. So other solutions that we talk about, and I make sure I drop the report from Human Rights Watch. And I'll also make sure that my email is in the chat, and our website is savesection9 at gmail.com, and we're on every social under that same name. It's save, like saving money, section, and the number 9. So the solutions, the first two are the ones that we're working on right now. The way that we work our solutions is we sit down with tenants. We've been doing this for about 2 years to 3 years now. And we start talking about what are the challenges that are facing tenants in public housing. One of the things that we knew was going to be a serious concern was the ongoing RAD and PAC, right? So the project-based Section 8 and the Section 18, which is threatening New York. So we decided that we were going to demand that HUD actually do an impact study. Now, HUD has done impact studies since 2010, but none of them focus on the impact on the tenant, on their quality of life, on eviction rates, and what the experience is like for the tenant, right? They focus on whether or not they can find enough management companies and that those management companies will be able to actually bring in the funding necessary to bring that development up to date or to rehabilitate the units. So our argument is that based on the research done by Human Rights Watch and by Neighbors Helping Neighbors, HUD should not allow any more privatization, that it should be put on a moratorium until this research is found. And because we're so confident that the methodology of Human Rights Watch and Neighbors Helping Neighbors will lead to the truth, which is that RAD endangers the quality of life of tenants, it increases mental health stress, it leads to PTSD symptoms, it leads to evictions, and it leads to a return rate, right? So if a tenant is removed from their unit or their development and sent elsewhere, like they were in Chicago, only 20% of them get to come back, right? So 80% of that community finds itself in limbo, displaced from their city, They find themselves in a homeless situation, right, which affects the entire community. So we feel that there should be no more privatizing until they're able to prove to us that this research was wrong. And then if the research is correct, right, if our assumptions are correct, then we want a path back. So a path back is something that was not included in the first version or any expansion that they've given to RAD. And we feel that any development that has gone through RAD or PAC should have a legal way to get back into Section 9 and to break the lease with these developers and the management companies that then take over. So we want to also make sure that there's a democracy process that's actually being applied to the way that project-based Section 8 and Section 18 are being applied. Oftentimes we'll get a call or an email from a tenant that's frantic and they're like, hey, you know, I am seeing that my development is putting up these notices and they're telling us that we have a new management company. What does that mean? And then I'll show up, like I just went to a meeting to the North Bronx at Boston Secor. And we went to the meeting and some tenants were like, hey, can you join us? And when I showed up, the tenant association president had passed away in November of last year. No one really knew when the decision to go private was made. The developer was confident that there had been a democratic process, that tenants had gotten the information, that they had taken a vote, but I was surrounded by tenants that were saying otherwise, right? So it's always dangerous to have a tenant association make a decision for the entire development. And if the entire development is not being given an option to vote, with at least 51% of the tenants having to vote one way or the other, then we know that some tenants are being silenced. So we're asking for that to be rescinded. We're also asking for a national state of emergency for Section 9 housing, because that's going to open up funding, jurisdiction, and oversight that we don't currently have. And then we want to actually see tenant rights being reinstated, right? So in the law, that is Section 9. It is the most robust set of tenant rights in the United States. It's something that everyone likes to copy and everyone likes to take when they're creating private housing. And the administration right now is creating what's called the blueprint for renters' rights. I don't know what it is with government and the blueprint, the word blueprint, but they're creating this at the federal level. And when we take a look at it, a lot of the things that they want to do, like ensure that there's a grievance process, create an infrastructure that doesn't lead to evictions, make sure that tenants have a right of say when it comes to the management of their homes and their community. All of these things are already afforded to those of us in public housing. The problem is that HUD and housing authorities for about the last 10 years have stopped being in the business of truly supporting public housing and have started to focus more on shifting public housing into private hands, right? Because of the money that can be generated by these. Our other solution is we're asking for a specific amount of money. If you start joining our meetings, we meet every Wednesday at 7:30 online. You'll notice that tenants in Safe Section 9 never talk about their individual repair needs. And this is because we all know that this is a systemic problem. The lack of working elevators, working heat, water issues, vermin, this is seen across the US. I've never met a public housing tenant that has said to me, oh my God, my home is perfect. It just isn't, right? But to us, the things that we have because we live in public housing, like access to resources and support in gaining employment, education. If you ever walk through a public housing development, you'll see that in the lobby, we have all of these opportunities being plastered, right? We get discounts on different training programs for like OSHA classes. We get support in starting our own businesses. We get support in starting savings accounts if we want to save money for buying a home, if that's a goal that you have. These are all things that are exclusive to public housing tenants. And one of the dangers of going private is that for the most part, public housing is about 40% senior, about 20% folks that are unemployable or disabled like myself, because of a disability, I can't hold a regular job. Then you have working families that make up about 20 to 25%. And then the rest are children under the age of 18. And one thing I like to point out is there is this assumption based on, the successful rhetoric started by the Republican Party that states that public housing is not mixed income, right? So it's just like a poor, a bunch of poor people living together in like this horrible slum. So that's a complete farce. If you look at the income levels throughout public housing, you'll see that at least 10 to 15% of the people that live in public housing make more than $100,000 a year. So the reason why people stay in public housing is because of the rent cap at 30% being guaranteed. It's because of these services. So if you grew up in public housing and you're actually taking advantage of the services and the infrastructure that is given to us, you will actually get to the point where you make $100,000 a year. Like I was above 100,000 because I had taken advantage of things because I pursued that path, right? So when we look at who's actually living here, it's important to note that we do have mixed income. The next solution that we have is we want to see the levels of housing stock restored. Now, we understand that some elected officials have gotten up, all energized by the idea of repealing the Fair Cloth Act. We think that that should be the goal, but we know that at this moment, we have enough available public housing units that cities across the country could expand their housing authorities and could adopt or through eminent domain, take on additional units and turn that into public housing. So like today, someone sent me the Mark Levine's housing plan that I think came out recently. And I'm looking through it and he's talking about using eminent domain. He's talking about redistricting places in Manhattan and turning that into affordable housing. Affordable housing is never going to be affordable to the community that actually needs it, right? Only public housing can serve a majority of the folks that are unhoused at this point in New York City. And turning those into affordable housing, in like Chelsea or turning them over near Hudson Yards, based on AMI, it's not going to be accessible to someone like myself. So I've always pushed back saying, instead of creating additional affordable housing that's linked to the AMI, you need to be creating new public housing, either by absorbing or eminent domain. Then we're talking about, making sure that public housing is around for the next 100 years. So we do that by looking at ways that we can become more sustainable and resilient. We have some legislation that's being drafted to actually take a look at why Congress continues to use racist or outdated beliefs about the community that is in public housing. As recent as the Build Back Better plan, we saw some terminology and some assumptions about our communities that were completely unacceptable. So we want to address that. And then we actually want to support tenants in developing a credit history via the payment of their rents. Finally, we want to look at what affordable housing really is. I think at the city level across the country, we're having these conversations that make it clear that the affordable housing definition created by AMI is not working. So we're actually going to be pushing to get affordable housing defined. And of course, we're going to look to 25% of your income being something that goes towards your rent, but 30% is acceptable to us. Then we talk about the specific cities. So if you have partners in other cities that might be interested in getting involved.
Ramona, one second. Could you, first of all, I think 30% is too high anyway. It wasn't, that was pushed by the developers back in the 80s, I think. I love what you're saying. I don't want I want you to keep going, but could you give us an example of some terminology you were speaking of?
Yes. So one of the key things in the Build Back Better plan talked about creating these mixed income hubs, because spaces where public housing was concentrated were non-functioning. It also spoke about the concentration of people of lower incomes, leading to like a stagnant environment. So it was just for us as we were reading it. So one of the things that we like to do is go look at like legislation at the federal level and we'll translate that for our tenants in a way that they can digest it. And a lot of the tenants felt that it was insulting to say that our communities were non-functioning when we had been, starved of resources. And we're living in a way where we were making the best out of a condition that Congress created. So those are like two concrete examples of that.
Yeah,
And
great.
up there, hey, what's up?
I'm sorry, somebody else had a question? Hello?
Yeah, I heard them on mute, but I think they.
Yeah, go ahead, Ramona. Yeah, you can continue unless someone else want to dip in for a question. Okay.
And I'll go through the chat in 1 second. So we'll go over the New York City specific solutions. We were able through the comptroller to get that audit. So I'm focused at the federal level. Marquise is doing New York City and state. And together we have solutions for New York and then for the federal end of things, right? So the comptroller is satisfying the forensic audit to a certain extent. We're going to see what he comes up with because the tenants that are on that board feel like pieces that were very important to us are not being looked at. So Section 3 is another benefit that public housing tenants have. So Section 3 means that you are preferred anytime that there is a contract being created. So if a contract is created within the public housing world, tenant-owned businesses are supposed to get preferential selection for that. And that hasn't been really enforced by NYCHA. So we wanted him to look at that as well. And then there's some pieces of the forensic audit package that he's not working on. So we're giving him a chance to look at the evictions. So for those that, really support RAD and think that that's a way forward for everyone, I would say look out for the comptroller's final findings because they're going to be in line with what Human Rights Watch found and also what City Council has been finding. One thing that we do still need is a new organizational plan. So like I mentioned, back in 2020, NYCHA started shifting its operations towards managing real estate, not supporting folks living in public housing. And we actually want to mirror the plans that were in operation in 1965 to 1970, because we found from some of our elders that those were like the really good years. So we want to create a new organizational plan and a new housing authority, which is the final request that we have based on that. So the removing of Greg Russ, he is partially gone. We continue to pray, cast spells and do whatever we can to get rid of him completely. We had someone that was here from HUD. I saw that there was a comment about HUD, but I didn't go too much into it. Daniel Sherrod is actually someone that grew up in public housing in Chicago. And when Cabrini Greens was being demolished, he was someone that got hired to go around and give eviction notices to his neighbors. And he was giving out the form that said, you need to leave, but you have a right to return. And like I mentioned, 20 years later, only 20% of those folks have made it back to Chicago public housing. So these solutions are currently being turned into legislation. And the legislation would be addressing each of these concerns and sometimes creating amendments because so much of the things that we're calling for are already part of a statute. There's just no reporting process or there's no infrastructure to make sure that the housing authorities are actually doing it. So I'll pause there and let me look through the chat and if folks want to pipe up.
Ramona, you've given us so much to chew on there. It's amazing how much work and effort you put in this. I know you've been at this for a while. And I agree with the idea of extracting the corporate hands out of. I hope I put that in the agenda properly and keeping protected against corporate involvement. I think we see eye to eye on that, and for many things actually. Sam's on here. We've been involved with the corporate takeover of. I'm sorry. Who's,
I think that was Kevin Conway at side.
yeah, let me just put him on
But I
mute.
see
sorry about accidental.
I see hands from Luana and then from Rue.
Yeah, go ahead, Luana.
You. I'm having trouble with my camera, so when I start to fuzz out, you'll know that it's just the camera, not me. So, Ramona, that's so much information to take in, and it's really a lot. So, I live in Chelsea. I grew up in Chelsea Projects. I lived there for 40 years. I've seen the decline of the project since I had lived there. There's so many myths that you had already mentioned, you know, when I grew up there were many working class families, intact families, hardworking people, kept their buildings clean. You know, we looked out for each other, and there were so many different things that were good about the projects, and there still are. My concern is I don't know where you are. I don't know. I wasn't really understanding if you have a lawsuit going on or whatever. But one of the things that concern me is the takeover of Hudson Yards of the property. And I know Miguel's here, but in Chelsea and Fulton. And I just heard that the demolition of several buildings in Chelsea will be replaced by a 37-foot tower that's sponsored by Hudson Yards. And every time I think about public housing, I remember Chicago and the demolition of all those buildings and the displacement of all those people, and those people never returning to their space. So in addition to the creation of more homelessness, I think that this project is not beneficial for anybody living in public housing. And I think that the fact that Hudson Yards is a managing agent for NYCHA, who still owns the property, gets to benefit by building additional buildings within the buildings. So not only is it an environmental issue, it's also a humanitarian issue as to the turnaround from public housing to private housing. You mentioned so many things, the 30%. I truly agree that the AMI in this area has increased. Last year, at the beginning of the year, we were over $184,000 of income. So imagine the amount of housing, affordable, quote unquote, affordable housing that's available for people with the income lower than that. There is none. So the affordable housing, the mention of affordable housing is a joke in its entirety. So I wonder.
Let me take a second and kind of like move folks to today, because I think the Fulton case is really interesting. So Fulton Houses decided in some way or fashion to go through the RAD process, right? They're a section, they're not a section 18 originally, but because they opened themselves up via project-based section 8 programming and welcome developers in, now the developers are saying that section 18 might become reality at Fulton, right? So back to the definition of section 18 and project-based section 8. Section 18 is Chicago, right? It's you're either exploding and demolition or you're completely deleting. And it looks like Fulton Houses, and Miguel can speak a little bit more about this, Fulton Houses is now being asked to vote. I believe they have 30 days. I don't know what the minimum threshold of the votes is supposed to be. I would always push for 51% of head of households minimum, but now they have to make a decision. And the decision is between 3 plans. Some of the options that they're being given include rezoning, they include demolition, and they include that promise of right to return. But my warning always is, if you look at the history of HUD, when it comes to a right to return, the percentage of people that get to come back just isn't reassuring, right? So what Luana is talking about right now is Fulton Houses is now in the hand of private developers and a management company that are making tenants choose between horrible conditions. And they've reached this point because they left public housing, right? Once you leave section 9, you expose yourself to all of these things and you don't have the rights to participation in the same way. There is an opportunity to create a residence council once you go private, like was mentioned before, but the resident council just serves as a bouncing board. They are no longer congressionally guaranteed the right to make decisions or contribute to the decisions being made at their development. So I just want to make sure like folks understand like what the trajectory at Fulton Houses has been over the last 2 years. And you can go ahead, Luana, if you had another question.
So I wanted to know where you are in, Fulton Houses. I know that Miguel Acevedo has been speaking for both Fulton and Chelsea houses. So I'm specifically concerned about the Chelsea Elliott houses. So I wanted to know where you are in the process of halting any of these plans, or are you in the process of halting? Because I really didn't understand where you were at in this process, and what can we do as affiliates and associates of those that live, advocates for those that live in NYCHA, can do to help stop this program?
So Safe Section 9 specifically, our actions are we go into the development and we educate the tenants through a similar conversation on the different sections, the history, and what their next steps are. We're a coalition made up of different organizations. So Marquise is Residents to Preserve Public Housing. They support more with the rallies and the actions. Then we have Justice for All Coalition out of Queens, which has a tenant toolkit. If anyone wants to get a copy of that, I don't think I can drop it in the, I can try to drop it in the chat, but that tenant toolkit is probably one of the best things that we can give to tenants. We have tried to lead lawsuits, and we continue to work with a lawyer, a free lawyer, to try and get a lawsuit in. But what we've been facing is that the United States never signed on to a United Nations decree or agreement that actually guarantees housing as a human right. So that has never been actually signed by Congress. Because of that, tenants in the United States do not have a right to sue Congress and HUD. So the decisions that have been made in lawsuits coming out of the 5th District Court for the United States, which is the court that oversees the Southeast of America, are, of course, super racist and do not believe in tenant rights. So when our lawyers have tried to draft a lawsuit here in the North, they often get kicked out based on the Southern court's opinion. So one of the things that Human Rights Watch requires, as they created a set of solutions as well, and they're pretty in sync with us. One of the things that they're asking for, though, is the signature, right? That the US enter into that agreement, because then that'll open the floodgate for tenants like us who have had our rights violated for decades to sue, and then to stop the privatization. So the way that we can actually stop the privatization now is we go into the development, we educate, we work on the tenant toolkit, and we find tenants that are interested in pursuing this process. And then they can put in direct complaints and take different steps against NYCHA and against their development to stop it. One thing that I know was done as Fulton was that one tenant was actually able to gather signatures from head of households. And I believe she got about 80% of the head of households to sign an eviction, not an eviction, a petition stating that they didn't want to be privatized. And that was ignored by Fulton Houses management, by NYCHA, by the mayor, Bill de Blasio at the time, and by HUD. So that shows, right, even when a tenant pursues a petition and tries to say this is not what we want, they can still be ignored. So it's important that at the federal level, we're creating a path back, because to be honest, it is exhausting to have to not only work on creating legislation, right, to uphold our rights and to ensure that we don't lose our homes. But then on top of that, we have different developments like Fulton, Boston Seaport, and like 3 others in the North Bronx, that are yelling, hey, we didn't agree to this. And as a group that doesn't have legal counsel with laws accessible to it that we can really enforce, we're pretty much screwed, which is why we said, our priority is going to be to make sure that we can give tenants a path back, because the infrastructure for tenants to come back will be clearly outlined, right? Like, what's the minimum amount of tenants that have to vote in order to be allowed back into Section 9, and what would be the process? And sadly, I think, 5 years after Ocean Bay and the Rockaways, folks talk about their neighbors just disappearing. When you get evicted from public housing, you have nowhere to go, and families are just walking out, and then you see all of their belongings out in the street the next day, because NYCHA will go in, or the management company will go in and just take them out. So a lot of the eviction stuff was really quiet in the beginning, and NYCHA was using the Rockaways as a model. They would take busloads of tenant leaders out there to go and look at the Rockaways and show them, the amenities and the way that they were living and the upgrades. And then it wasn't for like 3 years until some tenants started screaming, we're disappearing, that anyone started to pay attention. But, if you want to support us in either the New York fight with Residents Who Preserve Public Housing, or the Safe Section 9 federal one, we welcome the help and the support in any way that I say everyone has a skill that can be lent to this fight. So I know that's not a great answer, but I don't like to lie. This is a crappy situation, and tenants have been fighting for 20 years. A lot of the ones that have been doing it for 20 years have now told me that this is the first time that anyone actually explains to them, what are the policies that have created this environment, and what are the policies that are necessary to change it. But I mean, I know my ancestors wanted me to accumulate that knowledge and then bring it back to my community. I'm convinced of that. But I'm only 42, right? So I had to go out and get it. And when you look at communities like any public housing development, in my entire congressional district of the South Bronx, there's only 3 of us with a master's degree, right? So if our community isn't getting the resources and the services that we need to reach a new level of education and comfort in government spaces, we're going to continue to be cheated. And there's a Yonkers Housing Authority, the president there, she was all about RAD. And she said, I love my tenants. I want my tenants to live with dignity. And then she wrote an op-ed. It's been about a year since they finished going through the upgrade. And her op-ed actually said, it's great to have really nice apartments, but my tenants are falling apart because they lost the social support, right? So they don't have the resources. They don't have the community centers. They don't have the programming. And, for a lot of people in the Lower East Side and in the South Bronx, you look at these pictures of, when the crack epidemic was going on and our communities were being destroyed by it, you have the grandchildren of those generations now dealing with the consequences of it. And if you take away the human resources that, public housing gives us, we're kind of left in limbo. And remember the statistics, right? You're talking about seniors and children for the most part. And then you're talking about disabled folks.
Ramona, are you in touch with all these other housing? Are you guys coalescing with them?
Yeah, so one exciting thing is, now that I've depressed everyone, one exciting thing is that in the fall, we're being asked to come out to Washington, D.C., and we're going to be holding the first National Day for Public Housing. And this is going to be something that Congress is sponsoring. I always like to make it clear that some of our strongest supporters are Republicans. And that's something that we like to tell our tenants often, because I think when you look at the election for Kathy Hochul and you look at the election for Eric Adams, public housing tenants rallied behind these people, and we are getting nothing in return. So we have Republicans that are passing, Congresswoman Malliotakis just introduced a federal law to increase transparency when it comes to how tenant funding is being used and how contracts are being issued. right? So she is working with us very, very well, and we're about to expand to Iowa, Ohio, Arizona, and Texas, all through Republican support.
Mhm. Ramona, there we have a few hand raises
I
and
saw Philip, then Rue, and then Lawrence.
then Miguel too.
Oh, yeah.
And-
Thanks. I want to thank Ramona for her presentation. This information is a lot and fantastic. I also want to, I'm on the board of directors that Care for the Homeless, which provides quality health care to that population. I have the experience of homelessness myself. You mentioned the housing as a human right, and it was my understanding that it was in international documents. And because I had heard Leilani Farna speak on one occasion, she's a former rapporteur at the UN. It might be good to contact her. I don't think she's there anymore, but she might have good information for you, because human housing rights is a worldwide phenomenon, and there are activists all over the world fighting for that. And you might want to hook up with some of those people in the international community who would be supportive of what you're doing. I also want to mention the seriousness of what you're doing, because in my research, because I have a sociology background, I have concluded that homelessness is an ancient weapon of war. And the presentation that you showed us, the video that you showed us, concerned me because of the statistics regarding people being pushed out of housing and the insufficient number of people moved into other housing. To me, it's undeclared war that's taking place, and it's worth keeping that in mind, because the opposition is quite serious, and that's kind of what we are facing, what you're facing. I appreciate your advocacy and best, and you might want to find.
Kevin, you got need to be on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Muting.
Yeah.
I was just saying that Leilani Farna
Okay.
is a former rapporteur at the UN working on housing issues, and you might want to hook up with her to find out updates on what she's doing and get support in the international community, because there
is her last name F as in Frank?
I think it's F as in Frank, ARNA.
Okay. All right.
So she could be a big support. I was also saying that destroying houses is an ancient weapon of war, and that underlines the seriousness of what you're trying to do and what many of us are concerned about. So our activism is really in that context. The opponents of housing are very serious about moving people out of housing without opportunities to find housing. I saw your video, and that was very interesting to me, that people were being pushed out of housing and not finding housing to go back into. So that information that you've given us was very interesting, but the seriousness should be looked at in the context of war.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It is a war. It is a war.
It is. One of the things that you notice with like tenants that are going through RAD, what they'll often share with us is that when the privatization takes place, they start noticing that their neighbors are disappearing, and then it enters a transient culture, right? So oftentimes people love to say that if you got into public housing, you're only supposed to be here for a little bit of time, and then you're supposed to leave. And I call bull on that, right? It's BS, because when you're able to, as someone that doesn't have the means to own a home, when you're able to find a place where you can actually retire peacefully, like my grandmother did, she lived here until the day that she died, right? She passed away through COVID, and she always said to me, this is where I want to die. This is my home. And she had moved in when she had turned 63, and she died at 89, right? And for the seniors here, this is the community. And when folks start coming in, you know, from any place, right? If you start getting neighbors constantly cycling through, it affects your safety, it affects your mental health, it affects the grid, right? Or like the network, the roots of your community. And that's something that you don't get anymore in New York City, because most of us are forced, or, you know, we're being pushed from one place to the other because of rent. Public housing allows you to create these roots that go deep. And, you know, people in this building have seen me grow up since I was 12 years old. Like I feel like I have 200 grandmothers. And where else can you get that kind of support and that kind of love, right? You don't find that anymore as a renter.
Yeah, it's all becoming a transient, more of a piggy bank rather than a community building. Yeah, we're seeing this everywhere, and it's hard to really build any communities, especially when a medium range apartment cost, what before the pandemic was 34,000. Now it's up even higher. We should get to some other hands here because we're running a little tight on time now.
Rue,
Rue?
and then Miguel.
Sure, sounds good. Rue?
Hi, Ramona. Nice to see you again. I really want to push back on the Republican support, because the Republicans are behind the privatization. And even though there is legislation coming through for studies and analysis, they use that data in support of privatization in the long run. Also, there has been no Republican administration at a state or federal level that has ever enhanced Section 9 or Section 8. They have always cut back. So I would really, really caution on pushing that talking point of Republican support, because what that is almost a dog whistle to Republicans to join your effort to increase the voting capacity of Republicans in the legislatures. So we have to remember that the Republicans are in it for the long game and step in line. So it's really challenging to hear that. The other thing is, I would like to hear more about.
Drew, let me jump in there for one quick second. I think that's an interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up. I think there's a systematic destruction to the foundations of our society, from health to food security to housing, and I think that's a bipartisan effort, by the way. I don't want to get into politics of it all. That's not what we're here for, and we're not. But that is interesting because it is being demolished by our political system, and which we know is bought by the corporations.
Mm-hmm.
So I do.
I think New York is the perfect example of that, right? New York is Democratic far and far. Mm-hmm. You can't find anyone that wants to run on a Republican ticket and really thinks that they're going to win. Yet we've been leading when it comes to housing insecurity, poor health metrics, poor education metrics across the board. Now, I'm a communist, so I'm like not down with any party, but the problem that we have now is that Democrats, their long game is to either keep or grow their control. So for tenants, we find ourselves in a situation where if we continue to say, sure, Maxine Waters, you have our back, although Maxine Waters and Nydia Velasquez have never been able to do anything for public housing and they're like 100-year career, then we have to look for the new blood. And for us, we look to new blood both on the Democrat side and on the Republican side. And in the spirit of transparency, when we started this conversation last year in DC, when we went down in June, we met with AOC. AOC was like, this is great, this is moving, you guys are so prepared, this is amazing. Her office just introduced legislation, though, to focus on social housing. So what does social housing do to the fight for public housing? Social housing is something that is being created to focus on the legacy of progressives, not to really address our problems, right? So Chuck Schumer said, I will adopt all of the components of the Green New Deal for public housing, but I won't call it that. And the progressives said, no, you have to call it that. I said, I don't give a shit what you call it. Make our housing sustainable, make it resilient, and invest in making it live another 100 years. Social housing takes this further because social housing proposals that you'll see across the country are now calling for the subsidization of housing for people that make more than $55,000 a year. So it's affordable housing with a socialist paint job. And I'm currently struggling, I think Marnie might know this, that we're currently struggling to actually have follow-up meetings with AOC and her team. I can't get a meeting because now they want to focus on social housing because her legacy has to be that she was the progressive that brought all these things, not on actually achieving it or changing the circumstances or considering the conditions that people are living in, be it unhoused or be it in an unsafe environment. You want to focus on creating subsidized housing for people that make $55,000 or more a year in this housing climate. So while I'm not a fan of Republicans completely, Malliotakis's team is sitting there saying, okay, let's look at the first two solutions that you're calling for. And they believe that because HUD is publicly funded, HUD should be fulfilling their mission. So for Malliotakis, it's, okay, well, HUD is wasting money then, and they're mismanaging money if they're not fulfilling their mission. And you guys are telling us that they're not fulfilling it, that by privatizing, they're actually undermining the economy. And for her, she can't take any homelessness in Staten Island, right? She just can't afford it. So for her, it's an advantage to say to us, okay, well, I'm going to look at these first two solutions. And in addition to that, she's going to copy an introduction from Alexa Aviles, who's also a progressive from the council. So Alexa and Malliotakis are both in agreement about transparency. They're both in agreement about union jobs. And I think that's why a lot of the Republicans are welcoming conversations with us, because they want the union jobs. They want to, fuel the economy. Do they care about public housing? Probably not. You're totally probably right. I mean, I don't know her on a personal level. She might think we're all losers. But when it comes to securing her base and keeping her seat, she needs union and she needs truly affordable. And she needs to show that she's eliminating waste, right, of big government. So my talking points in a meeting with a Republican are totally different from what they are in a meeting with a Democrat. And then they don't realize that they're both fighting for the same thing. And that's the strategy that I'm using. It's not that I'm like preferring one or the other, but anytime we're around Democrats, they're just like, look at what the Republicans are doing. Don't vote for them. And then we sit down with a Republican and they're like, okay, yeah, we can do this. Yeah, sure. We'll support. Yeah, we'll be a co-signer. Yeah, sure. We'll be at National Day of Public Housing. Who's bringing the food? Do we need to do that? And then I'm sitting here fighting AOC on social housing. So it's an uncomfortable place for us to be as an organization. But like John said, the money in politics has put us in this position.
Yeah. It sounds like a whole new agenda to discuss. I want to know more about that, but we just don't have the time about how you speak to each of the sides, the so-called sides. And again, it's to me, I don't think much of a side, but anyway, we should move on.
I have one other.
Yeah.
As a member of the Eastern Wabanaki Nation, social housing actually benefits Native Americans who have the highest per capita low-income need for housing. The other thing is that at the beginning, you talked about not fixing NYCHA. So when a NYCHA resident hears that, over 339,000 of them, why are you eliminating them from this conversation of not fixing NYCHA?
So to clarify,
because you said it was a failing system. I'm not interested in fixing a failing system. We have it.
So the reason we say we're not going to fix NYCHA is because NYCHA, through that organizational plan of 2020, took themselves out of the business of managing public housing. So we have a organizational plan that has prioritized real estate and the real estate office within NYCHA, and has move down the list of priorities, things like building, development, management, resident engagement. So because NYCHA now has an organizational plan that is intended to put into place the Blueprint Trust program that I described, it is no longer giving any priority to the tenants that want to remain in public housing. So the reason we're asking for that new housing authority is because if we don't do that, the rest of us will be left behind, right? So when we've had hearings at City Council and they're like, okay, well, when is the trust coming up and when is it going to start running? They're like, oh, the change is underway. Everything's flowing smoothly. By June, we're going to have a citywide vote to see, which 25,000 units want to leave public housing. But when Alexa's asking them, okay, well, who's going to take care of the people that are still left behind in public housing? They don't have an answer, right? Because
that's what I want to point out is that why aren't you advocating for that answer?
The answer is that they're not going to do it. Under their current organizational plan, NYCHA will no longer prioritize public housing. So that's why we're saying we are not going to keep fighting, to occupy NYCHA or fund NYCHA or support NYCHA. We're asking for a new housing authority.
So we're abandoning those current residents, leaving them in the condition they're in.
No. I think you're twisting my words around.
No. I'm asking a direct question about the current NYCHA, and you have no interest in helping NYCHA fix.
No,
that's not what I'm saying.
I'm done.
But I can explain it again, right? So NYCHA 2020, there was a new organizational plan drafted. It's available on their website. When we reviewed this plan, the tenants across New York City that took the time to read it and elected officials noted that NYCHA was no longer prioritizing the maintenance, resident engagement, or design and completion process, right? So the projects department, we have someone that actually works there, that's a union member. Because of this, over the last 2 years, NYCHA has been implementing decisions and changes in their organizational chart that keep leaving those of us that are strict public housing Section 9 behind. So NYCHA already abandoned us.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, Ramona,
Yeah.
is you want to not replace. You want a different organization to take over what NYCHA is doing and to fulfill the mandates of what NYCHA should be and what originally set out to be.
Because this NYCHA, under this organizational plan and leadership, is not going to take care of the tenants that we're trying to advocate for. We need a new entity that will do that. And that's why we say it needs to be based on the 1965 to 1970 organizational grouping and charting and plan that NYCHA used to have, which is no longer in existence.
Do you think it would be easier doing it that way, or do you think it would be easier to mandating NYCHA to go back to the set of rules? And but then again, we've been replacing lots of heads at NYCHA. We've been through this argument quite a bit. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that because we've got such a short amount of time now, and we had a second.
And Miguel still waiting. Yeah.
We had a second speaker and that didn't show up, which gave us more time to you, which was great. But we do have to end this. So I think Miguel was up next, and he might have left. I don't see his hand.
Let me see. I see.
He left, John. He left.
Yeah, and I did want to hear from him since he was
I know, I did too.
Yeah, he must have had something to do, and maybe we can maybe he left something in the chat room. But anyway, let's get the last two in, and we have to kind of wrap up the meeting. You've really given us so much to chew on, Ramona. But go ahead. I think Charisma or Lawrence, who's next?
Two things. First off, the equating removal of public housing as war. I've often seen it since growing up around public housing. My dad worked for NYCHA, back until the early '60s, and it always seemed to me like it was human warehousing. And when you talk about war, that human warehousing, because where are you going to get a bunch of young men to go fight somewhere else more easily than from someplace that's concentrated of disadvantaged young men. Another thing is that the notion that it's all poor people in NYCHA housing, or people that are just always perpetually poor, is not at all true. I happen to know a family that they were, as a family, very successful from the 1930s or so, and it was passed down. And then 2009 came, and none of their businesses were eligible for a bailout because they were all under 250 employees. They were doing some really interesting stuff too with artwork and supporting lots of artists and making money off of that and blah blah blah. And they had massive. They were very, very successful, and then 2009 came and they lost everything. After they sold everything they had, then they were homeless and went into NYCHA. And this was 6 family members in 2 different units. And the youngest of these was already 60. And they were all working their whole lives. So the notion that NYCHA is just perpetually poor people. I mean, it's all kinds of people get homeless. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It served the purpose what it meant to, what it was built for. Good point. Charisma, are you there? Did you want to respond to that, Ramona, for a quick?
No, I mean, it's the nail on the head, right?
Yeah.
Charisma,
are you there?
Yes.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. When she said that they don't have anything in law stating that they're supposed to provide housing, I thought that was the purpose when they came about, when they demolished slavery. They promised the 40 acres and a mule, and the functioning of welfare was supposed to support people that didn't have that stuff or didn't buy property from their owners or whatever. Like, how could they say they doesn't have a plan for people that they have in a country where they had nowhere to turn to? Housing is a human right, and it always been, and people always needed somewhere to be housed. So how could they say they can't want to support people in fair housing?
That's a good question, Ramona. Is it because it's not ensconced into on the federal level, into the laws?
Yeah, so I started looking up the International Human Rights Standard, and I think this is something that Philip had also brought up. So because America has not signed on to this treaty, it is not truly enforceable, right? We like to think that we have a system or the infrastructure that believes that each person should be sheltered. And if you look, if you think back to the video, that was the reason for public housing. We wanted to take people out of slums and out of tenements in the Lower East Side and, in the southern part of Manhattan, and create an environment where people could live with dignity. And then this turned over time into a realization that you could support people in reaching new levels of education, employment, and income by providing them with resources, right? So public housing came from an America that believed in these principles. I think if we go back to
in theory,
in theory, like if we look at the financializing of housing, right? Rue made a great point about Native Americans, right? So I'm an indigenous person from the Caribbean, but you have indigenous people in the United States that are not receiving the type of housing that is dignified and that we are entitled to, according to our propaganda, because that's really what it is. But the funny thing is that the same office that looks over Native American housing needs is the one that looks over public housing, right? And that's not by mistake. It's by design. So HUD is divided into different priorities.
Yeah, but that stuff, you can't always get access to it because, like, I am Native American.
Yeah, you can't.
I don't get access to none of that stuff like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, right? And if you look at the way that HUD manages both Native American housing and public housing, there's similarities, right? In the fact that the funding is so small, in the fact that there are assumptions being made. I see Ruth shaking his head. I mean, you're welcome to speak up.
No, the Native American housing is not managed by HUD. It is managed by the Department of the Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah, but within
that is
HUD,
not HUD. It has nothing to do with HUD.
it does have something to do with HUD, because within HUD itself, there are different pillars. I'm not talking about the entire government. There is the Department of Interior, and there are other offices that oversee Native American services and rights. But within HUD, the same office that looks over public housing looks over Native American housing stipends that come from HUD, right? But I think that the way that the programming is being rolled out for public housing, for project-based Section 8, for light tech, it shows you that once you start attaching money to something that should be a human right, we start to disintegrate. You know, there's a case in Harlem right now where, like I mentioned in the chat, the problems with the light tech vouchers. So the city is behind, right, on paying out light tech vouchers, although they said that they were going to set aside some funding. And at the same time, the mayor is like, oh, maybe we should give money to, you know, private landlords to take in people with light tech. But if you're not paying off the bills you currently have, why are you going to give money to private landlords to then take the same type of voucher that isn't working already? That isn't about housing people. It's about giving money to these private companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see Philip has his hand up, unless someone else is in the chat.
Just a short point I would like to make. Even when there's ratification of international documents, there's opposition. The United Nations has human rights tenets, but there are Americans, oftentimes Republicans, who hate the United Nations because it is a supposed guardian of these human rights, or at least has these documents related to human rights. So the Republican Party favors defunding the United Nations. So at every level, we're up against this opposition to human rights in the world.
Yes.
And the fight is vast, widespread, and extended. So that's what we have to keep in mind, I think.
And I think you bring out something really interesting, which is, you know, where does our funding go? And like, how do we hold accountable our elected officials? Because you're supposed to be over there doing what we want you to do, right? So we don't tell people how to vote, but our PPH does a great job of interviewing every elected official for New York office that's willing to come on. And then they create like a little graph that basically shows you, hey, these are these people that are running for mayor, and this is what they're all saying about public housing. When people get to the poll, however, they make their own independent decision. Safe Section 9, we're not a nonprofit, we're not anything. We're basically like Ramona and a bunch of her friends. When we were looking at the governor's race, we did the same thing. And our PPH agreed with us to endorse Tom Zwazi, who a lot of people were like, no, he's too conservative. But he was the only one of the candidates at the governor level that was willing to work on the demands that our PPH had and Safe Section 9 had. Right, so it's like, we're in this weird space where we treat each individual. I don't think that should be a weird space, but we're treating each person based on their values, their promises, and the conversations they're willing to have with us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a skill, like, you know, John, if you ever want to have a talk about like, how do you lobby, right? From a values place, that's what we do in Safe Section 9.
Mhm.
And this council might have a set of values that y'all need to start really looking at. It's not just the Democrats, it's who is this individual?
Yeah.
And what policies is this individual going to support? Now, I dropped in the links for the HUD office on public and Indian housing. So folks can take a look at that. And also from the Human Rights Watch report, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is where our right to housing is codified. And that's what we haven't signed on to. So it was ratified back in 1948. And we still haven't signed it.
Yeah. Have you been in touch with, that could be a nice conversation. How do you lobby? And I agree with you. And they always say one thing and sometimes they don't mean it too. So that's something else. But anyway, have you been in touch with the interagency on homelessness, Victoria, maybe, who is a liaison on a federal level? They're looking to have to end homelessness. They talk about housing. I'm supposed to gather a panel together to meet with them. They spoke at our maybe the meeting before. You might want to look at our
The minutes.
meeting 2 months ago. I think it was 2 months ago. I'll send you the link. But and she's pretty knowledgeable, and she's working in earnest. Whether she's able to do what she wants to do is a different thing. But I think that would be worthwhile to pursue, and perhaps maybe you'd want to be on that panel with us, and we can discuss that later. But anyway, I hate to wrap this up because it sounds like we could go on forever, and you gave us so much to chew on. And it was a great presentation, by the way. If you can make sure you put your slides, send those to me. And I think you had that little thing you showed earlier on YouTube. Am I correct?
Yes.
YouTube. Yeah.
For everyone.
Yeah, you can always either send me the link or I can pull that off of YouTube. I'll make sure we push that. Let's discuss outside of this meeting where to go next, or if you have some thoughts, shoot me an email.
I just wanted to say one thing, John. It's Marnie.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. So I just wanted to tell people on the call is that this privatization of public housing, it's really the same thing as privatization of Medicare.
Yeah.
It's like the cutting of services. So I think, a lot of people on the call, they're up in arms about taking away their Medicare, but this is really, it's the same thing. It's the same principle. Mm-hmm. So kind of this narrative that, everything's going to be fine and the developers are going to spend so much money and fix everything in public housing. One of the RAD leases in 2019 that we looked at, it basically also had a clause that said that if the developer and the shareholders decided that the money for repairs was not going to elicit a profit for the developer, that they didn't have to do the repairs anymore. I mean, when you actually took specifically a look at the very, very strict house rules, it's astounding. So, I think, people on the call have to, take, the party line may not be exactly what, people say that RAD is going to be. So you have to kind of do your homework and be diligent and really, listen, like Ramona, wonderful presentation. And you have to really go and talk. I mean, Elliott, Chelsea, and Fulton are right down the street. When I go there, people are so against the demolition. I mean, you have to go and talk to people. And, in the buildings, Elliott, Chelsea, 415 and 425, there's a little park there. There are people there at like 1 p.m., 2 p.m. They sit there, they all chat, they all talk, they all know each other. Like they give each other food. And they're really, really against it. And also, what happened with Fulton in 2018, 2019, they're just like, they're not moving. Like people are not going to move. So I think that's a very powerful statement by the tenants. And, it just, you know, they're not going to move out of the building. So I think this idea of demolition is like,
It's scary.
it's like it's a pipe dream. I mean, people, I mean, they're going to barricade themselves through the radiators, but they're not going to move. So,
And
you
then
know,
one thing I'll add to Marnie's comment is I know there was a question about like, what do we do, right? So an immediate action is if you know anyone that starts being faced by privatization, when they get their lease, don't let them sign it. If you have seniors, right? So Marnie's advice of get to know the community. If you have seniors in public housing, do not let NYCHA do their recertification. Because when they do the recertification, especially for seniors, they will be recertifying them under a privatized lease without the senior being aware.
Yeah,
And
someone's
that's why
already
the
done
senior
that.
buildings are the first to go out, right? They're the easiest and the low hanging fruit. So if you have the capacity, make sure that they don't sign the lease and that they actually recertify with a friend or with a nonprofit, because the nonprofits are now running our community centers. So that's a great point.
How does that, okay, so recertify with the nonprofit.
So
But when they
before-
recertifying, aren't they go ahead.
So before, the way that it would work was NYCHA would manage all of our community centers, and the community had direct input into which services were going to be offered. Now we have like full, what's it called? Eastside Houses Settlement is here in the South Bronx. Eastside Houses Settlement provides children's programming and the senior centers. Now, Eastside Houses no longer has to respond to the request or the needs of us in public housing, although they're getting the congressional funding that is intended for just that. What they're doing is they'll take over our spaces, our community spaces, and they'll turn it into mostly childcare, right? They want younger children, which are easier, which is why in the South Bronx, in Bed-Stuy, and other parts of Brooklyn, our teens don't have programming after the age of 12. So right when they're getting to the crisis age, where we can lose them, there's no program, right? Before, my development would have programming for adults up to 21 until 10 p.m. every night, because we were latchkey kids. We needed after school care. These organizations want to take the funding for pre-K and 3K. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just, I can't have 12 providers focusing on cute 6-year-olds while my 12 to 17-year-olds are being recruited by gangs and our crime is out of control. And if you look at, like I always tell people when I do this teaching, I love to tell them, pay attention to the news. Every time there's a shooting with a child involved, someone under the age of 18, look at what's behind them. When the reporter is actually talking on camera and doing the sweep, it's public housing. And it's because this is the generation that's coming back down to burn the village, because the village isn't giving them what they need anymore. I don't have a place for my kids to go. So some of the programming that used to keep them off the streets, where we would have interdevelopment roller skating, interdevelopment parties, interdevelopment movie nights, that would suppress the gangs, right? Because you can't join a gang and hate your friend from Mott Haven houses if you're spending every Friday night with them. That's gone. And that's something that I wish someone would spend a lot of time studying, because I just don't have the bandwidth. But there was a great report on it by this one reporter that I almost like married emotionally, because he sat down and he said, look, this is the problem. You're not funding the social services that this public housing community had, right? So their grandparents and maybe their mothers were able to get to a certain level of education and find success, and our teens aren't going to get there because we don't have the resources. And I mean, my grandmother came to this country not being able to read or write, to work in a factory, but I made it to Harvard. That's not going to happen anymore. And what does that mean for New York City and for the rest of the country?
Yeah, we're deteriorating people's lives, opportunities, and yeah, we're losing it. And that's a good wrap-up point. Send us the link to that article, by the way. I'll make sure it gets into the recap. Marnie, thanks for that, keeping this going. No, that was a great ending
Mhm.
to, I couldn't agree with you anymore. We see eye to eye perfectly anyway.
Right, right.
And
Mhm.
and Ramona, thank you again, and everybody else for participating. And if there's any more questions, please put that into a chat. I'll get them to Ramona. We can discuss them again. I'm sure we're going to have some other conversations, and we have some forums we're working on. So we're going to be talking about affordability, and we're going to try and talk about it a little louder too. And let everybody hear what the problems are. This has been very enlightening, and thank you again, and thanks everybody else for joining us. But we have to sign off here. We're a little much really. We've extended this meeting to an hour and a half. Now we're even beyond the hour and a half. But
Yeah.
it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone.
It's
Have a
all
great-
that emotional intelligence, John. You bring all that emotional intelligence, so we hang in there with you.